Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Before I deliver my opening remarks, I wanted to note that today the committee is meeting both in person and virtually, which in my case is probably a good thing since I'm currently on day 5 of self-isolation due to mildly symptomatic COVID. I want to announce a couple of reminders to the members about the conduct of the hearing. First, members and staff who are attending in person may choose to be masked, but it is not a requirement. However, any individuals with symptoms, a positive test, or exposure to someone with COVID-19 should wear a mask while present. Members who are attending virtually should keep their video feed on as long as they are present in the hearing. Members are responsible for their own microphones. Please also keep your microphones muted unless you're speaking. And finally, if members have documents that they wish to submit for the record, please email them to the committee clerk, whose email address was circulated prior to the hearing. Well, good morning and welcome to our members and witnesses. For today's hearing, I'm proud to announce that Representative Perlmutter and I, in our copious spare time, have been conducting experiments on the groundbreaking topic in nuclear physics. We are excited to share the results of that effort today as a preprint, and we plan to submit it to the Reviews of Modern Physics. Well, just kidding, folks. What I'm actually referring to is an automated ripoff of a seminal paper published in the Journal of Physical Review in 1939 by Enrico Fermi called Neutron Production and Absorption in Uranium, which has certain applications and relevance to nuclear power and nuclear weapons. We took Dr. Fermi's paper and ran it through a free online fake text generator that uses artificial intelligence to disguise plagiarism. And this took about 15 seconds. We then took about 5 minutes to tweak a few sentences to disguise the true source a little better. And once it was ready, we ran this paper through 2 well-respected plagiarism checkers. Each of these detectors found our fake paper was, and I quote, 100% unique and 0% plagiarism. Not surprisingly, these fake content generators have presumably been tuned up to generate low plagiarism scores, sort of the spam bot equivalent of the generative adversarial network AI technique that's used to generate deepfake images and videos. And we even sent it over to the Inspector General at the National Science Foundation. Now, any real human physicist peer reviewer for a journal or an NSF grant proposal would notice immediately that this paper uses silly technical jargon and plagiarizes from a very famous paper. And they would also find it unconventional that the report was authored by 2 sitting congressmen and includes an acknowledgement to our ranking member, Jay Obernolte. But you can imagine how bad actors might use tools as we did to sneak plagiarized content past journal editors and peer reviewers. The AI-assisted plagiarism tool we use to make this fake paper is only one of the many in the arsenals of paper mills. These are criminal enterprises that sell authorship credits for the fraudulent papers they place in academic journals. Scientific disciplines such as the life sciences, which rely heavily on images to communicate the results of experiments, are popular targets for fraud because of how easy it is to manipulate images. Now, with the advent of sophisticated natural language processing software, it's becoming just as easy to tune out fraudulent but outwardly coherent text. Add in a few basic templates and the creation of hundreds of papers, complete with figures and citations, becomes the work of an afternoon. And this is much to discuss of real scientists who might spend months on a single paper. The scientific community must rise to meet this challenge, and it is already taking the first steps. Journals are looking for new ways to collaborate in detecting fraud during the review process. One recent effort is the STM Integrity Hub, which will serve as a platform for journals to share dedicated fraud detection tools. The first tool under construction will flag the simultaneous submission of papers to multiple journals, which is a strong indicator of paper mill activity. There's also a strong international community of researchers unaffiliated with publishers, many of them volunteers, who work to identify fraudulent papers following publication. Just as automation is enabling those committing fraud, it is also being used by these researchers to combat it. Next generation plagiarism checkers don't just compare text to text, but intelligently scan for indicators of AI-generated text. Other tools detect manipulated images or identify erroneous science within the text of the paper itself. The automation arms race is upon us. We are here today to discuss how researchers and publishers can develop tools and policies that will help them stay ahead of the paper mills. As we discuss scientific misconduct today, one of the most important things to keep in mind is the scale of the problem. Hundreds of papers with signs of fraud are indeed a serious concern. However, according to the NSF, a whopping 2.9 million papers were published last year alone. The number of cases of fraud must be viewed within that context. Creating and maintaining a body of scientific literature without flaws of any kind is an impossible quest, but published scientific literature remains the greatest body of human knowledge in the world, and it is our responsibility to look after its integrity. This effort begins with public dialogue. As Dr. Fermi said famously, whatever nature has in store for mankind, unpleasant as it may be, men must accept, for ignorance is never better than knowledge. I look forward to earning more knowledge today with the help of our esteemed witnesses. And I now request unanimous consent to include in the record for this hearing both the real paper by Dr. Fermi and the fake one that we created, as well as a letter from the NSF Inspector General about how they tried to detect our sleight of hand. Many thanks to Inspector General Allison Lerner, Dr. Aaron Manka, and their colleagues for their help in this. And now, the chair will now recognize the ranking member for the Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight, Mr. Obernolte, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Foster, and I'm sure everyone here on the dais joins me in wishing you a speedy recovery and wishing that your illness remains asymptomatic. We're looking forward to having you back with us in person. And I want to thank you for convening this hearing on an incredibly important topic, the topic of research integrity. It really is a topic that underpins our entire system of academic research here in this country. A couple of years ago, I went back to graduate school to finish my doctorate, and finishing that dissertation was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. An important part of any research is to review the field of literature and the body of work on your research topic to determine exactly what's been done before and what the state of the art in your research is. And I'll tell you, as I was going through the research in my field, it never occurred to me that some of those papers might be fraudulent. That's one of the reasons why this hearing is so important, is to call attention to what is a cutting-edge field in the body of academic research and literature. You know, this emergence of fraudulent research in paper mills. And also to cast some light on the ways that technology can both enable this bad behavior by creating powerful tools that anyone could use to generate fraudulent papers, but also in combating the spread of fraudulent research by identifying the papers that might have been generated with artificial intelligence technology. So it's one of the reasons why I'm very much looking forward to this hearing. I actually think that this is one of the things that we here in Congress can do very effectively, which is to simultaneously be a podium for the dissemination of information such as this, because spreading awareness of this is going to be key to preventing the proliferation of this bad behavior. But I also think we have a role to play in catalyzing more research into how prevalent this problem is, in funding some federal research into identifying the spread of the problem and identifying not only the causes of the problem, but also some of the technology-based solutions to that problem, and in general, raising awareness of this issue. And I also hope that everyone in the academic community joins us in recognizing just how destructive these paper mills have the potential to be for research integrity in general. I think the greater awareness that we have, not only this is a problem, but that of the need to make severe penalties apparent for those who engage in destructive behavior like this. I think that's going to be key to controlling the spread of this problem. So, Mr. Chairman, again, thank you very much for convening the hearing. I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses. I yield back.
Thank you. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Jennifer Byrne. Dr. Byrne is a professor of molecular oncology at the University of Sydney. Her research has helped inform an international debate on systemic fraud within the preclinical research literature, and she's an advocate for improved post-publication error reporting and correction. Dr. Byrne was a keynote speaker for both the 2021 Computational Research Integrity Conference and the Singapore Research Ethics Conference. She also chaired the Paper Mill Symposium at the 2022 World Conference on Research Integrity. After Dr. Byrne is Mr. Chris Graf, excuse me. Mr. Graf is the Research Integrity Director and leader of the Editorial Excellence team in Springer Nature. He also chairs the Governance Committee of the STM Integrity Hub, an initiative launched in early 2022 to help publishers collaborate to protect research integrity. Mr. Graf previously served as the chair of the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE, and as a member of the Program Committee for the 7th World Conference on Research Integrity. Our final witness is Dr. Brandon Stell. Dr. Stell leads a research team with the French National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS, studying the processing of sensory information in the brain. In 2012, Dr. Stell co-founded the website PubPeer.com to provide scientists with a forum to discuss the published research literature. PubPeer has since grown to be one of the leading sites for scientific discussion, with a dedicated community of users who've helped strengthen the scientific record by exposing and correcting its weaknesses. As our witnesses should know, each of you have as each of you should know, you'll have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing, and when you all have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. And we will start now with Dr. Byrne.
Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to be here today, and I would very much like to thank Chairman Foster and Ranking Member Obernolte and all of the distinguished members of the committee. So my name is Jennifer Byrne, and I am a cancer researcher who has been studying what I believe to be systematic research fraud for about the past 7 years. As we have heard, paper mills are commercial organizations that provide undeclared services to authors of scientific and scholarly publications, including fabricated data and manuscripts. This represents a significant threat to science in terms of both its practice and its reputation, and the literature must take a no-tolerance approach towards papers that may have been constructed solely for career or commercial gain. So there are a number of major factors that either drive authors towards paper mills or enable their activities. The first of which is unrealistic publication requirements that can be leveled across a broad range of authors, such as academic students and medical doctors who may not be able to achieve the publication requirements that their institutions require of them. Furthermore, in the field of publishing, there has been an increasing focus upon a commercial focus through increasing use of author-paid publication services. These add to digital publishing capacities over the last 20 years that have greatly increased the capacity for papers to be published rapidly and also have enabled the creation of new journals. In contrast, the experimental sciences have not experienced the same capacity to increase their rate of data production. Finally, a very important issue is the imbalance that currently exists between the production and the correction of scientific and academic publications. So most systems require appropriate balances between production and quality control. For example, cooking in a kitchen requires somebody to clean the kitchen afterwards. But at the moment in the scientific literature, the activity of production is greatly overwhelms the capacity to clean and remove waste from the literature. This is a major advantage for research fraud and fraudulent publications because once they're published, they are very difficult to remove. So the scope of the presence of fraudulent papers from paper mills within the scientific literature is largely unknown, and because this has been understudied. We recently screened just under 12,000 human gene research papers where we identified over 700 papers with errors that could signal paper mill involvement. Extrapolating from screening a very tiny fraction of the literature, I would estimate that the human gene literature contains more than 100,000 papers that have been produced by paper mills. This is a very serious issue, and the overall presence of paper mill publications in the literature could be much higher because obviously many disciplines beyond human gene research have been targeted. So the possible ramifications of large numbers of fraudulent papers are very concerning. For the research community, it's very likely that these papers are already misleading researchers and their research directions. They can damage research careers at all stages. encourage the support of unproductive research directions, and slow research translation through opportunity costs. So clearly, given this scale of paper mill contributions, automated tools are necessary for the identification of the products of paper mills. We have used automation to screen papers for wrongly identified nucleotide sequences. These are reagents that are used in experiments, and their identities cannot be determined by the human eye, but they can be verified by appropriate detectors. So the Seek and Blast tool that was created by Dr. Cyril Labbe in Grenoble in 2017 uses an automated system of detection. Our experience with this tool indicates that it provides a scale that cannot be matched by human experts, but its results need to be checked by humans in order to avoid false accusations of research errors. And clearly this type of support can be difficult to obtain through research grants. Tools such as Seek and Blast can also be used by paper mills to remove errors from their papers and create papers that are more plausible and more likely to be published. So it is very important in my view that we move towards targeting paper mills through features that represent their business model as opposed to features of their products. So publishers are now likely to be actively screening manuscripts for features of paper mills as an attempt to both detect and deter future submissions. We've proposed that another method that could be taken would be to require all research manuscripts to be posted to preprint service at the time of submission to reduce the duplicate submissions that Chairman Foster referred to in his opening address. We also believe that more aggressive steps are required to specifically disrupt the paper mill model, such as to delay manuscript submissions through compulsory registrations at least 1 year prior to manuscript submission. This would not deter experimental scientists, but would greatly damage the rapid publication timeframes that paper mills rely upon. We would also like to see journals turning the same tools that they are using for screening manuscripts into their own archives to identify the papers from paper mills that have likely already been published and that are already misleading researchers in their daily work. The Committee on Publication Ethics has recently described the need for retraction processes to rapidly adapt in response to the possibility of paper mills. We've proposed that journals could rapidly flag papers with verifiable errors using neutrally worded notices such as editorial notes before investigation starts, as opposed to when they conclude, so that researchers can be aware of papers having problematic features. So in summary, paper mills represent an unprecedented challenge to scientific and academic publishing, but they also provide a tremendous opportunity to enact transformational change. This can be achieved by increasing the oversight of scientific publishing, recalibrating our capacity to correct published information as well as to produce new information, and overhauling the reward systems that underpin the careers of researchers and other professionals who publish it within the academic literature. Thank you very much again for this opportunity to speak before the committee, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. And next is Mr. Graf.
Thank you, Chairman Foster and Ranking Member Obernolte, and esteemed members of the committee for inviting me. I'll give an overview following Jenny Byrne's overview of what research publishers are doing to safeguard research integrity. As introduced previously, I'm Chris Graf, the Research Integrity Director at Springer Nature, which is one of the world's leading research publishers, and chair of the governance committee for the Integrity Hub, which is a collaborative tech initiative from the STM Association, which is the global trade body for research publishers. My written testimony explains how the research publishing sector is facing one of its current challenges, namely that of paper mills and research misconduct. And I conclude in that written testimony that the opportunities exploited by paper mills are created somewhere upstream where research is done. Publishers can and are doing more to stop papers from paper mills. And other actors also have a responsibility, including the organizations that fund and employ and set policy for researchers and for research. And I'd argue that's where the solution lies, in a broad coalition of those who are able to act to make change happen. I'd like to use the rest of my 5 minutes for some background. I'll talk briefly about science, then briefly about publishing, and then a little more extensively about paper mills. First, science. So trust in science remains strong. The 2021 survey from NORC at the University of Chicago reports that 48% of Americans have a great deal of confidence in the scientific community. Members of those scientific communities published, well, my numbers say 5 million peer-reviewed scientific articles in 21. That's from a Dimensions database. That contrasts with the 2.9 million that the NSF reported. So lots of millions, but somewhere between 2.9 and 5. Within that, if we zoom in a little on COVID, there are now 630,000 COVID papers in the World Health Organization database for literature on COVID, on coronavirus disease. Half of those were published last year in 2021. So that's a view across science and a bit about publishing that science, but we're here to talk about paper mills and misconduct. So that's when things go wrong or actually very wrong. What happens then? Well, you may know, but we retract scientific papers when unaddressable concerns are identified. Those concerns range from honest and fundamental errors that might be embarrassing for a researcher, but that researcher should be applauded for addressing them and for retracting those papers and clearing up the inaccurate information they've published. They range from those honest and fundamental errors through questionable and misleading research, which could be naive, might be negligent, but probably isn't malicious, right through to misconduct, including that promoted by paper mills. And that kind of retraction doesn't happen often. Historically, 4 in 10,000 peer-reviewed science articles are retracted after publication. Zooming in to look at that through the lens of COVID, about 300 of the 630,000 COVID papers published so far have been retracted. And I think that's similar to the general rate that I described earlier of 4 in 10,000. Now, I think that's an indicator of significant and successful investments made into quality and into integrity by researchers first, and also by publishers when they come to publishing that. I'd argue that the contribution that research publishers make to quality and integrity is, well, I'd not argue, it's true. It's based on years of collaborative efforts. Publishers with other stakeholders for years have been developing and sharing resources about how to manage honest but fundamental mistakes through to the other end of the range that we talked about earlier, to misconduct and systematic manipulations. And publishers continue to invest in screening for integrity, including routine checks for plagiarism that we've heard about, but they're being enhanced and improved, as well as other indicators for ethics and quality, like the disclosures of conflicts of interest. Some publishers, as Jenny referred to, are beginning to roll out screening for image manipulation, which is a newer fingerprint that might indicate the presence of a paper mill. And both of these require investments not only in technology, but in actual people to use that technology. Even so, I agree that paper mills are a growing threat. Evidence suggests they're operating with relative freedom. When they find a way into a journal that has weak defenses, they certainly exploit that. And they do cause real damage. We've referred to that already. They steal credentials from legitimate researchers, for example. They con their way into editorial positions of power at journals, and then they use that to their advantage. And that's identity theft, and that's fraud. They do many other inappropriate things as well. So let me close with what I think the challenge is. Legitimate researchers currently benefit from a largely trust-based system. Solving the paper mill problem without making publishing harder and less trust-based for the vast majority of legitimate researchers, I think, is the challenge. The new STM Integrity Hub shows how publishers are taking collective action and using their combined knowledge and technology to do just that. So that's where I'll end. Thank you for the opportunity to present on how the publishing sector is responding to the challenges of research misconduct. It really was a privilege and is a privilege to be part of today's hearing. I genuinely look forward to your questions and also to continuing to serve in any way that might be useful for you. Thank you.
Thank you. And next is Dr. Stell.
Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Obernolte, and all distinguished members of the committee, it is an honor to join the hearing today. I am a U.S. citizen and neuroscientist with the French National Center for Scientific Research and president and co-founder of the PubPeer Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that maintains the website pubpeer.com. My testimony today is my own and does not necessarily reflect the views of the CNRS. In the fall of 2012, I launched PubPeer with the help of 2 colleagues, aiming to provide a forum for scientists to discuss the scientific literature. Today, I run it with the help of Boris Barber, another CNRS researcher. My motivation for the website is to capture discussions of the scientific literature that we scientists typically have in the lab and share them publicly to help other scientists evaluate the scientific literature. The site has witnessed the emergence of a community of expert reviewers and helped expose low-quality research. The numerous regular PubPeer users are now clearly more expert than most journal institution staff when it comes to the forensic examination of the literature. We currently receive around 3,500 comments and 700,000 page views per month. Today I will share insights from the first 10 years of running this website. When we launched the site, we received a flood of comments pointing out serious flaws in the literature. It was as if there was a backlog of unprocessed problems, and the website provided a new release valve to share them. Prior to the website, the procedure for sharing such problems was to write to the authors, their institutions, and the journals in hope that one of them would correct the record. Even when this process succeeded, it was extremely slow, and conflicts of interest often discouraged any action. The site allows this blockage to be circumvented. Issues can be immediately displayed online so that anyone interested can be made aware and authors can respond. Shortening by months or often years the time it takes to find out about these issues in the literature saves researchers time and ultimately tax dollars that would have been spent trying to build on flawed research. How can this be? How do these issues find their way into the literature? Perhaps the underlying reason is not too surprising. With the expansion of science, we continue to create new and important advances at a faster rate than ever. Recent examples being development of vaccines during the pandemic and the James Webb Telescope. However, this expansion creates challenges for identifying and supporting the best science and scientists. Job postings for faculty researchers and funding opportunities can now receive hundreds or thousands of applications, and shortcuts for screening those applications become more and more tempting. It's much faster to look up metrics about a journal where an article is published than it is to actually read the article. And applicants, perhaps falsely, believe that those metrics are the key to the advancement of their careers. In that atmosphere, it's easy to see how many of these issues we see raised on PubPeer find their way into the literature. Instead of publishing a boring result in a journal with a lower metric, there are incentives to select, misrepresent, or even falsify data in an attempt to give a falsely positive result that would land in a journal with higher metrics. A sensational example of the problem is paper mills, which produce articles for the sole purpose of artificially inflating the publication and citation metrics, while hoping that nobody ever reads them to see that they are fake. They do get published, sometimes by reputable publishers, but perhaps that's not too surprising since journals collect fees for every article they publish, regardless of its quality. Although I believe these paper mill articles cause little harm to the overall progress of science, since they would rarely be confused for real scientific results by scientists, they do highlight the underlying problem with scientific publishing. Incentives need to shift to place higher importance on the content of articles and not on the metrics. How can we fix this problem? The metrics surrounding articles are now ingrained in the community and unlikely to disappear anytime soon, even if they should. But commentary on sites like PubPeer can provide parallel sources of information that can be much more informative. If scientific commentary continues to grow and involve diverse sections of the community, evaluation committees could start relying on it more than the current metrics, so that incentives might shift back towards solid, reproducible results and stand up to public scrutiny. If contributions to this body of evaluation were rewarded when evaluating researchers for funding, promotion, and prizes, it is likely that scientists would participate to a greater extent. The federal government, through its funding of science, could play a huge role, but that potential influence is largely unrealized today. To our knowledge, funding agencies like the NIH and NSF have no procedures to exploit information available through community curation sites like PubPeer. In addition to providing evaluation of the publications referenced in grant applications, the information from these sites could be used to reward scientists that make exceptional contributions to public evaluation. I appreciate the committee's interest in this very important issue, and I thank you for your time and look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. And at this point, we will begin our first round of questions, and the chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes. So first, to all of our witnesses here, in your testimony, you all discussed the problem of incentives. The scientific community, still largely follows the model of publish or perish, where simply getting papers out the door is a big component in advancing a career. And so briefly, what would be involved in generating better metrics that the scientific community could use to assess the quality of the researcher? For example, do the metrics adequately, punish the ratings of researchers that have a high rate of retracted papers? Or maybe the traditional H-index, which I presume has been badly corrupted by paper mills. Maybe it should, instead of being reported as a positive integer, should be reported as a complex number with both a real and imaginary component for the H-index. So if you could just speak briefly on what improved metrics are under consideration at this point. And we'll go in reverse order, and I'll start with Dr. Stell.
So I personally feel that metrics in general are a horrible way of evaluating science. I think that we need to, as a community, put more focus on the content of the articles, read them, and evaluate scientists for what they publish, and not the metrics associated with those articles. And I think that one way of accomplishing this is by creating this body of information from scientists that are commenting on articles and creating a secondary source of information in addition to these metrics that will hopefully overtake the use of metrics one day.
And Mr. Graf?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. The things that I read about research assessment all point in the same sort of direction that Brandon just described, towards a more qualitative approach to understanding the impact of a piece of research. And in some nations, I believe that's done through descriptive case studies, where researchers prepare a report about a piece of work that explains its importance. And then the research assessment body uses that, perhaps with a suite of metrics, not relying on one, but with multiple metrics to form an opinion and to reward that researcher. So I definitely think the mood in the room is a distinct desire to move away from reductive metrics and towards something that's a lot more reflective of the complex nature of research itself and much more qualitative.
Dr. Byrne?
Thank you. Just to add to those comments, I think it's helpful if there are publication requirements leveled on professionals, that those requirements or expectations recognize people's training and capacity to conduct research. Clearly, systems where, for example, medical doctors are required to publish papers when they have neither the time, the resources, or the training to conduct research, that seems like a bad system. I would prefer a medical doctor to be assessed based upon their capacity to care for patients and provide cures. In terms of other forms of metrics, I think a number of commentators have thought about the desirability of the journal impact factor to also reflect other dimensions of publisher activity, such as their capacity to correct the literature as well as to produce it. Thank you.
And so another thing that I think has occurred to probably all of us reading your testimony is the role of government in supporting more and better automated tools on this. Is that, I loved, Dr. Byrne, your analogy with waste removal, that we just need a system for waste removal in the system. And so we, in normal communities throughout the country, part of the budget goes into waste removal, and maybe part of the solution is just turning up the fraction of our municipal budgets we devote to that. Are there specific proposals that you've seen that seem to make sense for putting more muscle into this effort?
Look, I think I've thought about this a lot, and it is unusual that science is so geared towards publication or production and sort of relentless production without that capacity to just clean up every so often. So there could be a system where, a certain proportion of research budgets could be devoted to that particular activity. Another system could be that if you are given research funding to do original research, that perhaps a proportion of that budget could be also devoted to a certain kind of quality improvement activity within the literature.
Thank you. And my time's expired, but I love the idea of financial incentives somehow. I've learned when I moved from science to politics is that people respond awesomely So that if there was some bounty on taking down garbage papers, I suspect we'd get a very active international community collecting that bounty. And so at this point, I'd like to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses. Really interesting topic here. So, I think it's always interesting to concentrate on the most negative consequences of the problem that we're discussing. So the attorneys call that the parade of horribles, the worst thing that could possibly happen. And in my opinion, when you're talking about paper mills, we've got 2 potential consequences. You've got fraudulent research getting rewarded by unqualified people graduating or by unqualified people earning promotion, right? So we can attack that perhaps with tools to identify these fraudulent papers and hopefully create consequences for the people that are using the paper mills. But to me, the more consequential problem is the impact on research integrity. This idea, and I think Dr. Byrne brought it up a little bit, that researchers might be misled in their daily work by the presence of these fraudulent papers in the body of literature. But I want to tunnel down a little bit on the likelihood that that would happen. And I'd like to open this up to anyone that wants to comment of our witnesses on this, because my first question is, if you were an editor of a journal, and you're reviewing a paper that was submitted and it came from a paper mill, wouldn't it be pretty immediately apparent? I mean, right now, the paper that Dr. Foster generated, that anyone with a technical background could read it and realize that there were inconsistencies. But, we're looking at maybe one more generation ahead, where AI tools might create something that would convince someone that wasn't an expert in the field. But if you're an editor at a journal, I mean, you're familiar with what the state of the art is in various fields. Wouldn't you immediately know, reading a paper, well, this doesn't make any sense because, really what people, the topics of research are A, B, and C, and, this isn't even consistent with that. Wouldn't people know about that?
Thank you. Look, I might I'll start and just give a brief answer. I think that some paper mill papers are actually highly plausible. They have already been accepted for publication, which means they've passed editorial review, they've passed peer review, and they've moved into the literature. So they're actually highly plausible, and they very closely resemble genuine papers. And I think that's their great danger. I mean, I can certainly think of many researchers who would read the kinds of papers that we study, particularly students and early career researchers that have not spent 30 years reading the literature as I have. These papers are highly plausible, and they are capable of misleading people purely because of that.
Interesting.
Thank you.
So, follow-on question. You mentioned peer review, and I am astonished that peer review wouldn't help us take care of this problem, because ostensibly, if you've got a panel that's doing peer review on a paper, those people are familiar with where the cutting edge of the research in that field is. I mean, I remember when I was in graduate school, for one brief shining moment, you're supposed to be the world's expert at a certain very narrow field, and so one brief shining moment. I knew everything there was about public sector budgeting and research on various budgeting methodologies, because that's what my dissertation was on. And at that moment, if you had given me a paper on something related to that field, I would have been able to say, wait, there hasn't been any research on that at all, and this doesn't actually make any sense because here are the topics that people were researching. So doesn't a good peer review system help us fix that problem?
May I take up the response there?
Dr. Graf, go ahead.
If I could try and tell a brief story to explain how the paper mills navigate around both editors and peer reviewers, that might help. So last year, I became aware of an editor-in-chief of a journal who'd become concerned about the volume of content being published and the scope of the content being published in a guest-edited issue that he had appointed a guest editor for. He emailed the guest edited issue, who he thought was guest editor, who he thought was the guest editor for that issue. And the guest editor, she responded saying, this has got nothing to do with me. So then we checked the email addresses and noticed that the guest editor was using an email address very close to the email address of the legitimate researcher who the editor-in-chief thought he'd appointed, but not the email address. And so our assumption is, probably the truth, that a paper mill has was using identity theft and identity fraud to place a fake guest editor in charge of this guest edited issue. That fake guest editor was then appointing fake peer reviewers to fake peer review the content and passing the content through as if it were legitimate and essentially, then triggering the publication of that content. So, so paper mills are devious and have worked ways around the largely trust-based and professional courtesy-based system that has been working quite well for decades, if not hundreds of years. And we need to tool up to prevent that better.
Right. Well, it's interesting. You've just raised perhaps we'll have a second round here. I see I'm out of time and I don't want to abuse the process, but it's interesting that Mr. Graf, you've just raised, a kind of another follow-on problem, which is the corruption of the peer review process in the service of these paper mills, which, I think is we'll have to put that up along with the other consequences of what we're discussing here. But thank you very much. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I think we will attempt to have a second round of questions if time and members' attendance allow. We'll now recognize Representative Caston for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. This is a fascinating conversation. I want to just start. I want to understand from Dr. Byrne in your research. Do you have any sense? And I realize that you're trying to quantify it. Do you have any sense of how much of the issue is plagiarism versus fraud?
That's a very good question. We don't really study plagiarism in detail. My background as a molecular biologist is the kinds of reagents that are used to construct experimental results. So we study the reagents that are used and whether those reagents are correctly identified. Sometimes we do see reagents appearing across multiple papers when that seems highly unlikely. So that indicates that there may be some role for plagiarism. But we feel that it is more likely that most paper mills are creating papers according to templates. So they have a kind of a basic skeleton of structure, and then they fill in the gaps in different ways.
Okay.
And they often target topics that are not very well understood. And so peer reviewers have no knowledge of these papers and so can't critique them. And
I ask just because it seems like the tools that we might have to address them are different, and there's ways to detect fraud and there's different ways to detect plagiarism. I'm curious for your thoughts, and I guess this would apply in either case. There certainly has been some talk in the, especially in sort of the bioethics community, about should we mandate that researchers publish negative results, since there's no real incentive to do that. And all of us who've ever worked in a lab knows that most experiments don't get you publishable results. And I don't know how we do that, but if we were to mandate that, that labs or researchers had to publish, all their experimental results, even if they were negative, would that help or hinder this problem?
Look, I don't know. I think that the publication of negative results is very important, but one of the issues around publishing negative results is all of these publications take time, and I think it will be difficult to incentivize that process. I mean, researchers, like everybody, are more interested in something that they are intrinsically interested in, and sometimes they don't find negative results particularly interesting. But I agree that I think we have to find ways of removing this incessant focus upon results that must be positive. And we need to be teaching our students that a negative result is just as important as a positive result. It's a result.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder sort of, to use a bad baseball analogy, if I only knew that a hitter, if I only knew the stats on a hitter when they got hits, I might not, I wouldn't know the difference between Ted Williams and, whoever's the third string on a baseball team. And so if I knew a researcher was batting 800, I'd be a little skeptical, right? Anyway.
Yeah, no, that's...
this is a very wonky one, and I suppose this would only work for falsified data. There's this wonderful little numerical trick that, in any sequence of numbers that's sequential, if you look at the probability of the digits, ones are more likely than twos are more likely than threes. Is there a way to automate that? Because I would imagine if I'm reporting the number of colonies in an agar plate, that's a very hard thing to fake, but it's algorithmically testable. Is that worth time? Are people already doing that? Is that just a dumb thing that I read about years ago that's not relevant today?
No, it's certainly not a dumb thing. I mean, people are certainly looking at that kind of thing, particularly clinical trial data, patient data, where it's actually very, very difficult to fake random data. So I think the answer is that we need different kinds of tools for different kinds of data and different kinds of science. And we don't have all of those tools. We have some of them now, but we don't have them all.
So my last question is sort of deeply philosophical, and to try to get this off in a minute. It's always struck me that whether you're doing basic science, at the lab bench, or doing research, going through the literature review, I always thought Immanuel Kant got it right, that all you can do is prove things wrong. You can never totally prove them right, and things are more likely to be true when you try to falsify them and fail. And I think our human brains are really good at that kind of analysis. Our ability to say, well, if this thing is true and the causality arrow points in this direction, then that would imply that this other thing is true. Let me see if that's the case, and if not, I got some problems over here. I don't know how you write algorithms to do that. I think our brains are just sort of uniquely set up to do that, and it's what the traditional peer review process is really good at. Is it even algorithmically possible to do that sort of Kantian falsifiability? And if so, or if not, is there any way to sort of satisfy that a paper that is deemed worthy of publication, someone has attempted to do that falsifiability and failed? Does that make sense? I realize I'm getting very philosophy of science there, but does that make sense as an approach?
Look, it makes sense. I don't know if it's possible, but I'm not an algorithm person, so perhaps one of the other witnesses could answer.
I think that this would be possible. This sort of thing might be possible, but I think that the more algorithms we build, people are going to find ways around these algorithms. And so I think that, this is maybe shouldn't be our focus, is trying to find every individual instance of fraud, but changing the incentives so that fraud is no longer a winning strategy, that we put the focus on the content of the articles and make it so that it's just not important to do fraud anymore.
Thanks. Then I yield back.
Thank you. I'll now recognize Representative Bice for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Foster, and thank you for the witnesses for being with us this morning. My first question really is to any of the witnesses, and that is, how long do you think that paper mills have been impacting academia, and how many of them do you believe that are based in Russia or China?
I can start. In terms of how long they've been operating, I don't think we have a clear answer for that. I would estimate that at least since 2008, so possibly for about 15 years. In terms of the numbers of paper mills, again, if I refer to the literature, a paper was written in 2013 that estimated the number of ghostwriters that were operating in China at that time in 2011. They estimated nearly 1,800 full-time equivalent ghostwriters in China. There's been very little research done on this topic, and so I think the answers, the answers today are not clear.
Thank you. Mr. Graf, did you want to follow up with that?
Thank you. I could add a little. I think it's true that the strategies and tactics that paper mills have been using since the date that Jenny Byrne cited have changed. In my the information that I've studied, the use of AI and algorithms to generate text in articles probably began around 2019, and that's when you've got a massive change really in the tools that paper mills have got available to them. So that talks both to sort of how long and also to change in their practices, which refers back to what Brandon said, which is the sort of arms race thing. It really would be beneficial to get out of the arms race because and really address the incentive system. I think that's probably the right way forward.
How do you, to follow up on that particular point, Dr. Stell, what do you think we should be doing to try to address this in a way that still allows for researchers to be able to publish papers, but it's not solely focused on the data? Where's the fine line there to be able to publish a research paper that has value that can be utilized by the community, but yet isn't focused on specifically the data that's contained within it?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think that anything we can do to put more focus on the content of articles is going to help enormously. And I think the one thing that that hasn't been done that could be done is rewarding people for contributing to a body of commentary. If we have this body of commentary, this is going to take the focus off of metrics and put it on expert opinion of scientists. And if we can reward expert scientists for their commentary, we're going to get more participation. And then these evaluation committees are going to start using that expert evaluation. And so I think that is, for me, is the way forward, is to just create another body of evaluation parallel to metrics, which are going to continue to exist for a little while, but perhaps could be replaced by more expert informative opinion.
And I on Mr. Graf's point, and Dr. Stell, you're welcome to comment as well on this, but I think that one of the concerns I have being a member of the House Armed Services Committee is how do we ensure that these research papers aren't being influenced by foreign governments in a way that could have a negative impact on security? Any thoughts there?
Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I think it's a question about misinformation, isn't it? And I don't think that the motives behind all of this are to promote this misinformation. I think they're the simplest of motives. Paper mills want to earn money. They earn it when researchers give it to them. Researchers want to earn money. They earn it when they get a paper published and when they get promoted. So I don't know. I don't have evidence to suggest there's a conspiracy from foreign agencies going on.
You don't think that there's sort of falsification in a way that American academia would be impacted by that falsification?
I don't think that the motives are to impact American academia, no. Okay. I think the motives are very isolated to the individual researcher who's buying this bogus service from the paper mill.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Okay.
Well, thank you. And I think we will now start a second round of questions. And so I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. So I'd like to return to the subject of trying to get the financial incentives right, because as Mr. Graf pointed out, that really drives a lot of this. You know, I've often fantasized that if it cost people 50 cents to send me an email, and then they got the 50 cents back, if I saw fit to respond to it, that my spam filter would have a lot less work to do. And so first off, has anyone estimated how many man hours would be actually required to adequately peer review this flood of papers, and what the total cost of that would be and the cost per paper?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, even order of magnitude? Okay, if you can just reply for the record, I'd be interested in that. Because that's, you know, it seems like a daunting number of man hours, and you want to engage the best and brightest in any field towards reviewing those papers, and it's a huge burden to put on their time, and might not be the best use of their time.
I can add a little information, but it's not really about peer review. It's about the internal review in an investigation of potential paper mill papers that I've been conducting with my team. And that review has been ongoing since September last year, and has taken, I haven't added up the person hours, but there's been a team of, let's say, 5 people. It's more than 5, so maybe it's between 5 and 10 people working at least part-time, sometimes full-time on the exercise. And we spent money on consultants as well. So, and that's been focusing on a total kind of universe of about, well, we looked at about 3,000 papers. So, so that's not looking at the whole world, right? That's only looking at a small part of the world. And there you go. That's the sort of sketch that I've got for you, the amount of for you about the amount of effort that it's taken post-publication, not with the peer review community, but with colleagues internally at a publishing company.
Now, would a more significant cost to submit a paper for review be an effective partial remedy? Or would that really place an unacceptable burden on emerging researchers? For example, if, when you got a grant, 5% of the grant money, you could allocate toward getting any publications reviewed, and then you'd spend that money where you thought it would do the most good. Are there incentives like that that could be put into place?
That's an interesting idea.
Has that ever been talked about?
But yeah, publicly, there's a couple of different campaigns to there's one led by James Heathers to a gentleman called James Heathers to claim payment for peer review, and perhaps if I don't know how much sort of ground that movement has made. I do worry about equity and access to publishing services.
Yeah, so presumably this would be based, the fees would be based on ability to pay, based on your situation and your country's situation.
Yeah.
But maybe that's a partial solution. You also mentioned identity fraud, and there is a lot of progress. In fact, we're marking up this week a bill that we're pushing forward to on secure digital identity. This is just providing tools for individuals to prove they are who they say they are online, and also to attach verifiable credentials to that digital identity, so you can't fraudulently claim, basically credentials that you haven't earned. And so, are there things underway in the academic community already? It also provides a mechanism for punishing people that abuse the system, or at least identifying them so that they can be dealt with appropriate suspicion. Are there anything along those lines underway?
I think I can just speak to that briefly. So there's a system of author identity called ORCID that has been running for some time. Some journals are now requesting that all authors have ORCID identities as a way of combating paper mills. But I think paper mills are very adept at getting around these kinds of fairly small hurdles that we place in front of them. So there is evidence that paper mills then simply take out ORCID identifiers for their potentially real or fake authors. So that's a major issue, I think. I think that probably also pertains to paying fees for submitting manuscripts. Paper mills would probably be willing to pay those fees.
Okay, but presumably when you claimed an academic credential and then attempted to attach it to a fake identity, at some point the university whose academic credentials were being stolen would blow the whistle on you. Anyway, I'm out of time here, and we'll yield to the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Well, thanks, Chairman Foster. I want to talk a little bit more about research integrity, because I think that is the most dangerous consequence of these false and fraudulent papers floating around. So, the presence of misinformation is an issue that we are dealing with as a larger society. It's not just academia, and it's not just research. Certainly, social media, there's lots of information out there that's true, there's lots that's not true, and there aren't a lot of tools for a user to try and figure out how to differentiate between those two. But we've got a tool in academic literature that is not available to social media, and that is the hierarchy of different scientific publications. I mean, to call something the literature ignores the complexity of the fact that scientific publishing is not monolithic, and we've got journals that are highly respected in their field, and then journals that are less so. So, question for anyone who would like to answer: is there a way we can leverage that hierarchy? The fact that there are journals that can serve as highly trusted sources of information. Can we leverage that to help us solve this problem?
If I may start, one of the things that we can do is really get behind a transition or transformation even away from subscription publishing to open access publishing. When we make all of the more trustworthy information that's available in journals, including those at the top end of the hierarchy, more open, it's there as a counterbalance. to the misinformation that is freely and openly available on the web. So I think there's an argument there for that transformation to open.
Well, Mr. Graf, I agree that that would be great, but I mean, there are monetization problems with doing that. How would you solve those? How would you alter the monetary incentives that empower this current subscription model?
That's a whole inquiry of its own. But yes, we're working on that as across the research publishing sector, and we're intent on making the transformation, moving the money that is currently being spent on subscriptions into a way to enable those journals to then be open. So it's complicated, and one type of openness won't suit all research disciplines and all journals or regions on the planet, but that's our goal.
Right. Well,
one thing I would just like to add to that is that there have been studies looking at the impact factor of a journal and the number of errors that are found in the journal. And the higher ranking journals are not necessarily immune to the problem. So I think if we start relying on these tiers to tell us which is reliable information, it's not as accurate as we would hope it would be.
interesting. I wouldn't have guessed. Dr. Stell, while I've got you, one of the things that I was fascinated by is in the previous round of questioning, you were talking about how some papers, fraudulent papers, had been identified on PeerPub. And I'm wondering, as we grapple with this issue of eliminating the commercial and academic incentives for publishing fraudulent papers, what were the consequences for the authors of the papers that your website identified? Did they have consequences?
There are examples of absolutely zero consequences, but there are also examples of people being fired from their positions for having been caught cheating and exposed on PubPeer. So the consequences range.
So when there were consequences, what triggered the consequence? So someone on PubPeer looks at a paper and says, this was generated by a paper mill. Here's my proof. Here are the inconsistencies. And so the PubPeer community agrees this paper is fraudulent. Does someone reach out to the employer of the author of this fraudulent paper and say that if they cited this paper in their resume, then they were hired under fraudulent circumstances? I mean, did someone take that affirmative action?
That's a very good question. We're not part of that part of the process. What we do is we provide a platform for people to discuss these things and make it public. And I have to say that paper mills are a real minority of the discussions that happen on PubPeer. But the fraudulent work is usually some sort of image that has been copied, some data that has been misrepresented. It's been exposed on PubPeer. That is now public for everyone to view, including the people's employers and other committees. And so presumably it's taken up by those people, and they're taking actions. It's not, we're not part of anything other than making that information public.
Right. Well, I see I'm out of time. I want to thank everyone for the really interesting and consequential hearing here. But let me reiterate my conviction that when we're talking about the spread of disinformation, and academic literature is no exception, I think that trying to focus on eliminating all fraudulent papers is a fool's errand, because I think they're going to be out there. So I think the better solution is to try and create trusted sources of information where some peer-reviewed vetting takes place, and people can have a higher degree of trust in. And to your point, it's clear that more work needs to be done there. But certainly I think that's where the solutions are going to be found. Anyway, thank you for everyone for the discussion. It's been really interesting. I yield back.
Thank you, and I want to second ranking members' comments about the importance of trusted sources. It used to be, at least I felt when I was in my career in science, if you stood up and said something that was not true, that was a career-ending thing. And now, as I moved from science to politics, it seems like if you stand up and say something that's not true, it seems to only increase your chances of re-election. And so we have to do a better job, and science should continue to lead by example of taking a very hard line when outright fraud is detected. And I was encouraged to hear that at least some universities are, you're losing tenure and you're out of here if you participate in any of this, because that it's important. Science always operates at the edge of what is known, and we cannot tolerate deliberate lying when we're trying to flesh out the details of nature's complexity. Now, before we bring this hearing to a close, I want to thank again our witnesses for testifying, and the record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from the members and for any additional questions the committee may ask of our witnesses. So the witnesses are now excused and the hearing is now adjourned.